The independent pathologist did not receive Nolan Wells' lungs or his throat. When Dr. Roger Mitchell, the forensic pathologist retained by Ben Crump and the Wells family, received Nolan's remains for examination, the lungs and portions of the neck had already been removed during the state autopsy conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office on July 7th. They were not returned to the body. They were not made available to Mitchell. The most critical organs for determining whether a person drowned, the lungs, which would contain water if the person was alive when they entered it, and the airway, which would show whether water was aspirated, were absent when the independent examiner tried to reach his conclusions. Mitchell wrote in his report, "The most significant limitation in the independent autopsy was the inability to directly observe the airway and lungs for water and directly observe the stomach for gastric contents." And then he wrote something else. Parts of Wells's throat were not in his body when it was received for review. Therefore, this pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or a cause of death. Cannot rule out injury to the neck. The organs that would tell you whether Nolan drowned were not available. The tissue that would tell you whether his neck sustained injury was missing. And the official Mississippi State Medical Examiner's autopsy, the one that removed those organs, the one that has the specific findings from the examination of those organs, has not been publicly released. 3 weeks after the examination, the organs are gone. The independent pathologist cannot reach a conclusion, and the state has the findings from the organs that would determine the truth, and has not shared them publicly. Nancy Grace said it on her show, "Somebody's lying." She also said she did not know what caused Nolan Wells' death. She emphasized there are many accidental possibilities, but she said the deep red subcutaneous tissue on his occipital bone, the back of his skull, and the missing lungs and throat are pieces of a case that simply don't fit together into a clean, accidental drowning narrative. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we are covering the most significant new developments in the Nolan Wells investigation: the missing organs, the independent pathologist's findings, the heavy alcohol email, the new celebrities who have joined the case, the official pushback from Mississippi's Public Safety Commissioner, and what the convergence of all of it means for an investigation building toward a grand jury. Before we go further, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at Forensic Disconnect, we unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe. Let's go back to the beginning and establish the full picture, because the missing organs detail cannot be understood without understanding what the independent autopsy was trying to determine and why the missing organs make that determination impossible. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, where he played wide receiver for the Southwest Mississippi Community College football team. On the evening of July 3, 2026, he made salmon for his family. The next morning, he got on a boat with his friends to celebrate the 4th of July on Horn Island, a federally protected barrier island approximately 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. At 4:31 p.m. on July 4th, the boat departed Horn Island. The GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources confirms the exact departure time. Nolan Wells was not on the boat. Witnesses told police they saw him on the island as late as 6 p.m., an hour and a half after the boat left. His body was found on July 6th by a National Park Service agent patrolling the island's northwestern tip, face down in the water, fully clothed. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office described it as a possible accidental drowning. No foul play identified. His phone was found on the boat. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office conducted the official autopsy on July 7th. They removed the standard organs for examination and analysis. Among those organs, the lungs and portions of the throat. Those organs are the specific anatomical structures that tell a forensic pathologist whether a person drowned. Water in the lungs means the person was alive when they entered the water. Alive and breathing, pulling water into their airway. The specific presence and distribution of water in the lungs is one of the most important findings in a drowning death investigation. The throat tissue tells you whether there was any compression, injury, or trauma to the neck. The official autopsy has those findings. They have not been publicly released. When Nolan's family, through Ben Crump, commissioned Dr. Roger Mitchell to conduct an independent examination, Mitchell received the body weeks after the official examination. The lungs and portions of the throat were not returned to the body before the independent examination. They were retained by the state. Mitchell noted this limitation explicitly in his report. He could not directly observe the airway and lungs for water. He could not observe the stomach for gastric contents. He could not rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or cause of death. The result of the independent autopsy, cause and manner of death undetermined pending further investigation. And then the finding that Nancy Grace highlighted, deep red subcutaneous tissue on Wells's occipital bone, the back of the skull, below the skin, at the base of the head, a finding that the independent pathologist noted alongside the undetermined conclusion and the cannot rule out injury to the neck. Grace said on her show, "What caused the deep red tissue?" She said she did not know. She said there are many accidental possibilities. But she said those pieces, the red tissue at the back of the head, the missing lungs, the missing throat tissue, the undetermined conclusion, do not assemble into the simple picture of an accidental drowning. Ben Crump, at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago on July 22nd, presented the independent autopsy findings and called on local law officials to share with Mitchell their findings from the state autopsy. He wants the state to tell the independent pathologist what the lungs showed, what the throat tissue showed, what the organs that were removed before the independent examination contained. The state has not responded publicly to that request. Now let's also address the heavy alcohol email, because a document from Mississippi that emerged this week contains a specific new detail. Nolan Wells had heavy alcohol intake before disappearing on Horn Island. This is the first official document to address Nolan's alcohol consumption on July 4th. The specific content of the email and its source within the Mississippi investigation has not been fully detailed in public reporting. But the specific claim, heavy alcohol intake before disappearing, is the first official acknowledgement of the specific factor that has been discussed since Warren Hudson confirmed that the island was covered with people and most were partying and drinking. Heavy alcohol intake changes the physical picture of what happened to Nolan in the water. A person who is significantly intoxicated and enters the water faces elevated drowning risk even without any external force. Impaired coordination, impaired judgment, impaired swimming ability, all of these are factors that increase the likelihood of accidental drowning. The specific blood alcohol content at time of death is what the toxicology results will show. If the toxicology confirms heavy alcohol intake, the official accidental drowning narrative gains specific forensic support. But heavy alcohol intake does not resolve the missing lungs question. It does not explain the deep red tissue at the back of the skull. It does not explain why the organs that would confirm drowning were removed before the independent pathologist could examine them. Nancy Grace said, "Somebody's lying." She was addressing the specific inconsistency between the accounts of what happened on the boat, Warren Hudson's account that Nolan chose to stay, the emergency audio that multiple people interpret as containing "Is he dead?" before the dispatcher answers, the phone found on the boat instead of with the body, and the official "nothing to see here." Now let's go to the new celebrity voices. Because the public attention to this case has expanded significantly in the weeks since July 4th, and the specific people who have added their voices and their resources carry weight with specific audiences that the existing advocates do not reach. Ms. Rachel Accurso, is the creator of educational children's content who has amassed tens of millions of followers on YouTube. She makes videos for toddlers and young children. Her audience is parents of small children, almost entirely. She is not a true crime figure. She is not an advocate. She is a children's content creator who looked at the Nolan Wells case and decided to speak publicly about it. When Ms. Rachel speaks, parents of young children listen. The specific audience she reaches, people who would not typically follow true crime, who would not encounter the Nolan Wells case through Nancy Grace or Ben Crump or even through general news coverage, received this case through her platform. That represents a specific expansion of the public pressure on the investigation that no other celebrity voice in this case could have produced. Colin Kaepernick has also joined the public attention to this case. His involvement, like the others, represents the specific convergence of athletes and celebrities who connect Nolan's story to the broader pattern of Black deaths that do not receive sufficient scrutiny. Mississippi's Department of Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tindell pushed back. He appeared on CNN's First of All with Victor Blackwell and said Mississippi is a much different place than it was in the past. We see the world a lot different than those that tainted our history as a state. That pushback is the official response of a state official who is watching the national narrative around the Nolan Wells case frame Mississippi through the lens of its racial history. Tindell is not wrong that Mississippi has changed, but the specific question is not whether Mississippi has changed in general. The specific question is whether the investigation into Nolan Wells's death is producing the full, transparent, complete examination that the family is demanding. And that question has not been answered by the state's official organs being removed before the independent pathologist could examine them. Now let's go back to the phone. Because the phone on the boat, confirmed by Christine Wansley, takes on a new dimension in light of the missing lungs. Nolan's lungs and throat tissue were removed during the official state autopsy and have not been shared with the independent pathologist. Nolan's phone was found on the boat rather than with his body. In both cases, the specific physical evidence most relevant to determining how Nolan died, the organs, the phone, is in the possession of entities other than the family's independent investigation. The state has the organs. The boat had the phone, which is now in FBI forensic custody, in a joint examination with the family's attorneys. The independent pathologist cannot determine cause of death because he does not have the organs. The family cannot independently verify the phone's contents because the FBI is conducting the forensic examination jointly with their attorneys. In both cases, the family is dependent on official institutions producing the evidence that would allow an independent determination of what happened to Nolan. In both cases, those institutions have not yet produced that evidence publicly. The grand jury is the mechanism that will require them to produce it under oath. The state medical examiner will be required to present the findings from the lung examination. The FBI will have completed the phone forensics. The 60 witnesses will testify. The toxicology will be in the record. Everything that is currently withheld from public view will be presented to a panel of citizens with the full force of subpoena power behind it. That is why Ben Crump wants Mitchell included when the grand jury hears the case. Not just the state's pathologist, the family's independent pathologist, who has documented what was missing from Nolan's body when he received it, whose report says cannot rule out injury to the neck, whose limitations section documents what the state removed before the independent examination could be conducted. The grand jury will hear both. Let's go deeper into the specific forensic significance of the missing lungs and what it means for the two competing theories of Nolan's death. In drowning investigations, the lungs are the primary organ of interest. When a person drowns, when they are alive and breathing as they enter the water and begin aspirating, water enters the lungs through the airway. The specific presence of water in the lungs, its distribution, its volume, and its relationship to the lung tissue are the primary forensic indicators of drowning. A person who enters the water already dead does not aspirate water. The lungs of a person who died before entering the water look different from the lungs of a person who drowned. This distinction, drowning versus post-mortem immersion, is the specific forensic question that the lungs answer. Was Nolan alive when he entered the water, or did something happen to him before he entered the water and his body was in the water after he was already dead? The independent pathologist cannot answer that question because the lungs are not available. The state medical examiner has the answer. It is in the findings from the official autopsy, and has not released it publicly. The specific significance of this is enormous. If the lungs contain water consistent with drowning, the official accidental drowning narrative is forensically supported. If the lungs do not contain water, or if the pattern of water in the lungs is inconsistent with accidental drowning, the narrative requires a different explanation. And the independent pathologist, retained by the family specifically because they do not trust the official process, cannot reach a conclusion on this central question because the evidence has not been made available to him. Ben Crump's demand that the state share its findings with Mitchell is not a procedural nicety. It is the specific request that the official investigation produce the evidence that allows an independent assessment of the most important forensic question in this case. The state has not responded publicly to that request. Now let's also address the specific significance of Dr. Mitchell noting that he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or cause of death. Because this specific language, cannot rule out is the specific forensic formulation that stops a case from being closed. Cannot rule out is not a finding of injury. It is a documented inability to exclude it. When a pathologist writes cannot rule out injury to the neck, they are saying, the evidence available to me does not allow me to determine whether this person's neck was injured. There is tissue missing. There are findings I cannot interpret in the absence of that tissue. I cannot say the neck was injured. I cannot say it was not. In the context of a case where the phone was on the boat, where the background audio contains what some listeners interpret as, "Is he dead?" where the body was found fully clothed face down in the water, cannot rule out injury to the neck is the specific language that keeps every possibility open. The official autopsy has the throat tissue. It has the specific findings from the examination of that tissue. If there was no injury to the neck, those findings would show it. The state has not released those findings. The independent pathologist cannot determine whether there was neck injury because he does not have the tissue. And the deep red subcutaneous tissue at the occipital bone, the finding that Nancy Grace highlighted, is in the same anatomical region, the base of the skull, the back of the head. The specific area where the independent autopsy noted the discoloration that could be decomposition or blunt force injury, and the specific area adjacent to the neck where the independent pathologist cannot rule out injury. None of this is a finding of homicide. The independent pathologist explicitly said he cannot determine the cause of death. He explicitly noted accidental possibilities. The undetermined conclusion is not a determination that something wrong happened. It is the specific forensic acknowledgement that the available evidence is insufficient for any conclusion, and that the insufficiency is at least partly the result of what was removed before the independent examination. Now let's address the heavy alcohol email in more detail. Because the specific document, an email from within the Mississippi investigation describing heavy alcohol intake before disappearing, is the first official document in this case to address the alcohol question directly. The email has not been reproduced in full in any public reporting as of this video. What has been reported is the specific description, heavy alcohol intake before disappearing, not moderate alcohol consumption, not drinking with friends. Heavy alcohol intake. If Nolan's toxicology confirms a blood alcohol content consistent with heavy alcohol intake, the forensic picture changes. Not because intoxication removes the questions about the missing organs and the phone and the background audio, but because intoxication is a specific contributing factor that changes the probability distribution of what happened in the water. A heavily intoxicated swimmer on a hot July afternoon in Gulf Coast water is at significantly elevated risk of accidental drowning. The currents near Horn Island can be rough. The Jackson County coroner told CNN that his office has received numerous drowning victims from the barrier islands over the years. The specific combination of heavy alcohol intake, Gulf Coast currents, and an 18-year-old who had been on an uninhabited island for hours in July heat is the combination that produces accidental drownings. But the toxicology has not been released. The heavy alcohol email is a description from within the investigation, not a confirmed toxicological finding. And heavy alcohol intake does not answer the missing lungs question. It does not explain the deep red tissue at the base of the skull. It does not explain why the phone was on the boat. The toxicology will answer the alcohol question definitively. If the blood alcohol content is high, the accidental drowning narrative gains forensic support. If it is not high, if the heavy alcohol email is inaccurate or refers to a different person, the narrative requires re-examination. The investigation is building toward the grand jury. The grand jury will hear the toxicology. The grand jury will hear the official autopsy findings. The grand jury will hear the phone forensics. The grand jury will hear the 60 witnesses under oath, and then it will decide. Now let's also address what Ms. Rachel's involvement means for the specific trajectory of this case. Because the Nolan Wells case has done something unusual for a true crime investigation. It has escaped the true crime audience and reached populations that do not typically follow these cases. Ms. Rachel has over 13 million YouTube subscribers. They are primarily parents of children aged 1 to 4. Her platform is the farthest possible distance from Nancy Grace's platform, and she spoke about Nolan Wells. When a children's content creator with 13 million subscribers speaks about a case, she is reaching millions of people who would otherwise never encounter it. Parents who are putting their children to bed, who follow Ms. Rachel for toddler content, who do not watch crime news, those people now know about Nolan Wells. They know his name. They know that a young man went to an island on the 4th of July and did not come home. They know that the case is unresolved. That specific expansion of the audience is the specific expansion of the public pressure that makes official investigations harder to close without a complete and transparent answer. The more people who know about Nolan Wells, the more people who will be asking whether the grand jury produces accountability. The more people who will be watching when the official autopsy findings are eventually released. The more people who will be asking whether the state ever shared its lung findings with the independent pathologist. Millions of parents of toddlers are now part of the public pressure on this investigation. That is not something that Nancy Grace or Ben Crump or Tyler Perry or Al Sharpton could have produced. That is what Ms. Rachel's involvement adds. Now let's think about what Commissioner Tindell's pushback tells us about how the state of Mississippi is experiencing this case. Because his appearance on CNN to defend Mississippi's racial history is the specific defensive posture of an official who is watching the Nolan Wells case become a referendum on the state. Tindell said Mississippi is a much different place than it was in the past. He said the state sees the world differently than those who tainted its history. He is responding to the specific national narrative that has framed the Nolan Wells case through the lens of Emmett Till and the documented history of racial violence in the state. His defensiveness is understandable. The comparison to Mississippi's racial past is not a comparison that official Mississippi welcomes. But the specific question is not whether Mississippi is a different place. The specific question is whether the investigation into Nolan Wells's death is meeting the standard that the family and their advocates are demanding. And that question is answered not by Commissioner Tindell's appearance on CNN, but by whether the state medical examiner shares its lung findings with the independent pathologist, by whether the phone forensics are completed and shared with the family's attorneys, by whether the grand jury receives the full evidentiary record and produces a decision that reflects it. Mississippi may be a different place. The investigation will demonstrate it. Let's also bring in all the details from the investigation that have emerged in the days before today. The phone on the boat, the $175,000 reward, the salmon dinner, the prior sightings, and connect them to what the missing organs reveal. Nolan made salmon for his family on July 3rd. He got on a boat the next morning with his friends. The boat arrived at Horn Island at 11:14 a.m. At 4:31 p.m., the boat left. His phone was on it. His body was found 2 days later. Between 4:31 p.m. and approximately 6 p.m., witnesses told police, Nolan was still on the island. He was seen by people who had no reason to lie about it, people who were simply on the island celebrating the holiday and noticed a young man. That 90-minute window between the boat's departure and the last sighting is the window the investigation is trying to fill with official autopsy findings that have not been released and phone forensics that are ongoing. The missing organs sit at the center of that 90-minute window. If the lungs contain water consistent with drowning, Nolan entered the water alive during that window, sometime between the 6 p.m. sighting and when his body was found on July 6th. If the lungs do not show water consistent with drowning, something happened to him before he entered the water. The window closes differently depending on what the lungs show. The state has that answer. The independent pathologist does not. Warren Hudson said Nolan chose to stay with the girl he was with. He said it was not like they left Nolan. They asked him to board, and he chose not to. A separate account describes Nolan cradling a girl in his arms in his final known moments. Katie McCormick's sister said Katie assumed Nolan was getting on the boat, assumed the friends telling him to board wouldn't leave him. And in the background of the CETO emergency call, 12 seconds before the dispatcher answers, multiple listeners believe they hear a woman's voice say, "Is he dead?" The people on the boat deny it. The official investigation says nothing nefarious. The independent pathologist says he cannot rule out injury to the neck, and the lungs that would answer the drowning question are in the possession of the state. Now let's also put the $175,000 reward in the context of the missing organs. Because the reward was assembled by people who believe accountability is needed, Tyler Perry, Al Sharpton, Terrell Owens, and Dr. Benjamin Hudson, the father of Warren Hudson. $175,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. The father of the person whose account most directly supports no foul play put $50,000 toward finding out if someone should be arrested and convicted. Whatever that means about what Dr. Hudson believes, the money is there. And now the independent pathologist has said he cannot rule out injury to the neck. Now the lungs and throat tissue are confirmed missing from the body before the independent examination. Now a document from within the Mississippi investigation describes heavy alcohol intake. All of these pieces exist simultaneously. They do not assemble into a clear picture of what happened. They assemble into the specific picture of an investigation that has not yet produced the transparency that would allow anyone outside the official process to assess what actually happened to Nolan Wells. The grand jury will produce that transparency, under oath, with the full evidentiary record, including the official autopsy findings that have not been publicly released. Ben Crump wants Mitchell there when the grand jury hears the case. He wants the independent pathologist who documented what was missing from the body to be present when the state presents what its examination found. He wants the two accounts, the state's findings from the complete body and the independent pathologist's findings from the incomplete body, to be presented together so the grand jury can assess both. That is the specific transparency the family is demanding, not an accusation, not a predetermined conclusion. The full picture, under oath, before citizens who will decide whether the evidence supports charges. The investigation is building toward that moment. Nolan made salmon for his family. His phone was on the boat. His lungs are in the possession of the state. The independent pathologist cannot rule out injury to his neck. The grand jury is waiting. Let's also examine what the specific chain of evidence in this case tells us about how investigations of this type typically proceed, and why the specific sequence of what happened to the physical evidence is itself significant. The standard procedure in a death investigation that will produce an official autopsy is to retain all significant organs for examination and potential additional testing. When an investigation anticipates that the cause of death will be contested, or when there is any question about whether a second examination may be requested, the responsible procedure is to retain the organs that are most relevant to the key forensic questions. In a case involving a young man found face down in water, with unknown circumstances of entry, with a family that has already expressed skepticism about the drowning narrative, with a prominent civil rights attorney retained within days of the death, the specific organs most relevant to the key forensic questions are the lungs and the airway. Those organs were removed. They were not returned to the body. When the independent pathologist arrived to conduct the second examination, weeks after the initial autopsy, he found the body without the lungs and without portions of the throat. The most important evidence for the most important question in the case was not available to him. This sequence can be explained innocuously. In standard autopsies, organs are removed, examined, and typically returned to the body after examination. If the state's examination of the lungs was complete and the organs were retained for additional testing rather than returned, which is a standard procedure when additional toxicological analysis is anticipated, the independent pathologist's inability to examine them is the result of timing rather than suppression. But the specific optics of this sequence, the state removes the lungs, retains them, the independent pathologist arrives and cannot complete his examination. The state does not publicly share its lung findings. The independent pathologist writes, cannot rule out injury to the neck, are the optics that the Wells family, Ben Crump, and the public advocates for this case are pointing to when they say the investigation lacks transparency. Ben Crump's specific demand, share the lung findings with Mitchell, is the demand that the state resolve those optics by demonstrating that its findings support its own characterization of the death. If the official autopsy found water in the lungs consistent with drowning, sharing that finding with the independent pathologist would resolve the cannot rule out injury to the neck and support the accidental drowning narrative. The fact that those findings have not been shared, publicly or apparently privately, with Mitchell keeps the narrative open. The state may share those findings before the grand jury. It may share them at the grand jury. The grand jury process will require the state medical examiner to present their findings under oath. At that point, The lung examination results will be part of the official record, available for the grand jury to evaluate. But it is now a month since Nolan Wells' body was found. The official autopsy was conducted 3.5 weeks ago. The lungs are retained. The independent pathologist has documented their absence. The family is waiting for the state to share what it found. The state has said nothing publicly about the lung findings. Now let's also go back to the phone one more time. Because the phone and the lungs are the two pieces of physical evidence that most directly connect to the question of what happened to Nolan, and bring them together. The phone was on the boat. It contains Nolan's digital history for July 4th, the messages he sent and received, the location data that places him at specific points on the island, the photographs and videos he took, the calls made and received. The FBI is conducting forensic analysis jointly with the Wells family's attorneys. The family believes content may have been deleted. The lungs were in Nolan's body. They contain the specific biological record of whether he was alive when he entered the water, whether he breathed water in, whether he drowned. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner has those findings. The independent pathologist does not. Together, the phone and the lungs represent the two most specific pieces of evidence about what happened to Nolan Wells on July 4th. One is digital. One is biological. Both are in the possession of official entities. Neither has been shared publicly. The grand jury will receive both. It will receive the phone forensics from the FBI. It will receive the lung findings from the state medical examiner. It will hear 60 witnesses under oath. It will have the toxicology confirming whether the heavy alcohol email is accurate. It will have the official autopsy findings and the independent autopsy findings and the specific discrepancy between them. And then it will decide. Nolan Wells made salmon for his family. His phone was on the boat. His lungs are in the possession of the state. The independent pathologist cannot rule out injury to his neck. The grand jury is waiting. The investigation is not finished. Let's also think about what the specific combination of celebrity involvement tells us about where this case sits in the American cultural landscape right now. Tyler Perry, Al Sharpton, Terrell Owens, Colin Kaepernick, Nancy Grace, Ms. Rachel, Ben Crump. The specific list of people who have spoken publicly or contributed financially to the Nolan Wells investigation is a list that spans conservative and progressive America, that spans entertainment and sports and advocacy and children's education, that spans the specific communities that do not typically agree on much about race and justice in this country. Nancy Grace is a conservative television personality who built her career prosecuting criminals and advocating for crime victims on Fox News. Ms. Rachel is a children's content creator who reaches progressive-leaning parents on YouTube. Colin Kaepernick is the specific symbol of racial justice advocacy in American sports. Terrell Owens is one of the greatest wide receivers in NFL history who came to Ocean Springs to sit in the front rows of a funeral for a college wide receiver he had never met. When those specific voices, from those specific corners of American culture, all point at the same case and say the same thing, that case has reached a level of national significance that transcends any single community or political frame. The Nolan Wells case is not just a Black Lives Matter case. It is not just a conservative law and order case. It is a case that has produced a specific, unusual coalition of people who agree that the official characterization requires scrutiny. Commissioner Tindell appeared on CNN to defend Mississippi. That appearance is itself a measure of how far the national attention has penetrated. When the Mississippi Department of Public Safety Commissioner appears on national television to defend his state's racial history in the context of a drowning investigation, the case has become something that goes beyond the investigation itself. It has become the specific moment at which Mississippi's past and present are being weighed against each other in public. What Tindell cannot answer, what no official pushback can answer, is the specific forensic question that the missing lungs raise. He can say Mississippi is different now. He cannot explain why the independent pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck. He cannot explain why the lungs have not been shared with the independent pathologist. He cannot explain what the official autopsy found. The answer to those specific questions is what the grand jury will demand. Now let's think one more time about Nolan as a person, not as a symbol, not as a data point in a racial justice argument, not as a case, but as the specific 18-year-old who made dinner for his family the night before he went to the island. He made salmon. That is the specific human fact that sits underneath all of the forensic and legal complexity of this case. He cooked for his parents. He said goodbye. He went to a friend's house for the night. He woke up on the 4th of July and got on a boat to celebrate. He was the tallest person in the doc photographs. His arm was around his friend's. He was smiling. His lungs are in the possession of the Mississippi State Medical Examiner. His phone was on the boat. The independent pathologist cannot rule out injury to his neck. His mother asked, "Why are we so quick to call this an accident?" The grand jury will eventually answer that question. The official autopsy's lung findings will eventually be shared, at the grand jury, under oath, by the state's own pathologist. The phone forensics will eventually produce what they produce. The toxicology will confirm or complicate the heavy alcohol email. The 60 witnesses will testify. And then a panel of citizens will decide whether the evidence the investigation has built, the GPS data, the emergency audio, the phone on the boat, the missing organs, the undetermined independent autopsy, the heavy alcohol intake, the 60 witness accounts, supports charges against anyone for what happened to Nolan Xavier Wells. He made salmon for his family on July 3rd. The investigation will tell his parents what happened after that. Let's also address what the Life 360 data means, because Nancy Grace mentioned it specifically, and it has not received enough attention in the broader coverage. Life 360 is a family location-sharing app that uses GPS to track the real-time location of family members who have consented to share their location with each other. Many families use it so parents can see where their children are. Many college students have it active because their parents asked them to install it before leaving home. If Nolan Wells had Life 360 active on his phone, and if his family had access to his location data through the app, that data would place him at specific coordinates at specific times throughout July 4th. It would show where he was on the island. It would show whether his location data stopped updating at a specific time, and if so, when. Nancy Grace mentioned ripping apart the Life 360 data in the context of her critique of the drowning theory. She was questioning whether the location data from Life 360 is consistent with the official narrative. If Life 360 data exists for Nolan's phone, it is one of the most specific pieces of digital evidence in the case. It places him on the island, or on the boat, at specific times with a precision that eyewitness accounts cannot provide. It would confirm or contradict the witness accounts of seeing him on the island at 6 p.m. It would tell investigators where exactly he was in those final hours. The FBI's joint forensic examination of the phone would include Life 360 data if the app was installed and active. That data, combined with the GPS data from the MDMR, creates a specific layered picture of where Nolan was and when. The family believes content was deleted from the phone. If Life 360 data was among what was deleted, or if the app was disabled at a specific time on July 4th, that timing becomes its own piece of evidence. The phone forensics are ongoing. The Life 360 data, if it exists, is part of what the FBI is examining. Now let's address one final dimension that connects everything: the specific way the investigation has managed public communication and what that management tells us. The official investigation has been controlled and cautious in its public communications since the beginning. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office said no foul play identified at this time, the qualifying at this time doing specific work. The DA said the case goes to the grand jury when the investigation is complete. The state medical examiner has released no findings publicly. That communication posture, controlled, cautious, protective of the investigative record, is the communication posture of an investigation that is either protecting evidence for prosecutorial use or protecting a determination from public scrutiny before it is finalized. Both are legitimate reasons for that posture. They produce the same public experience: silence where the family needs information. The independent pathologist's report fills some of that silence, but only partially, because the state's findings are not available to him. The 60 witnesses fill some of it, but only through voluntary interviews that do not carry the force of sworn testimony. The grand jury will eventually fill it, but only when the investigation is complete and the state is ready to present its full record. Until then, the family waits. Nolan's parents wait. The $175,000 waits. The grand jury waits. And the specific answer to what happened in the 90-minute window between 4:31 p.m. and 6 p.m. on Horn Island, between the boat's GPS-confirmed departure and the last witness sighting, is waiting in the official record that the state has built and has not yet publicly shared. The lungs are in the state's possession. The phone is being examined. The toxicology is pending. The official autopsy is unreleased. The investigation continues. The answer is coming. Nolan made salmon for his family. He went to the island. The boat came home. He did not. His lungs are in the possession of the Mississippi State Medical Examiner. His phone was on the boat. The independent pathologist cannot rule out injury to his neck. The grand jury is waiting for all of it. Let's also bring together all of the elements that are still pending and frame what the next 30 to 60 days look like for this investigation. Because understanding the timeline helps explain why the case is not resolved and when it might be. The official autopsy was conducted on July 7th, 26 days ago. The report has not been released. The standard timeline for a complete autopsy report with toxicological findings is 4 to 8 weeks from the time of examination. At the 4-week mark, the report is in range for release. At 8 weeks, it is overdue by any standard. The heavy alcohol email suggests that some toxicological information is already available to investigators. The description of heavy alcohol intake implies that at least preliminary toxicological findings have been returned. If the full toxicological panel is complete, the report may be waiting on the complete documentation of all autopsy findings rather than on the toxicology itself. The phone forensics are ongoing. If the FBI received the phone in July and began analysis immediately, the forensic work may be complete or near complete. The joint examination process with the Wells family's attorneys adds complexity, ensuring that both the official investigators and the family's legal representatives have access to what the forensic work produces. The 60 witness accounts are being processed. Any inconsistencies the investigation has identified are being pursued. The specific accounts that matter most, the 7 people on the boat, the people who saw Nolan at 6 p.m., Katie McCormick, have been documented. When the autopsy report is complete, the toxicology is finalized, the phone forensics are concluded, and the witness accounts are fully processed, the investigation presents everything to the grand jury. That convergence, at current pace, is most likely in September. Approximately 30 to 45 days from now. In September or October, a Jackson County grand jury will receive the complete evidentiary record of what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island on July 4th, 2026. It will hear the official autopsy findings, including what the lungs showed. It will hear the independent autopsy findings, including the cannot rule out injury to the neck and the documentation of what was missing. It will hear the phone forensics. It will hear the toxicology. It will hear 60 witnesses under oath. And then it will decide whether an 18-year-old who made salmon for his family on July 3rd and got on a boat on July 4th and was found face down in the water on July 6th with his phone on the boat that came home without him, whether his death is something the law must act on or something the law cannot reach. Nolan Wells's parents are waiting for that answer. Christine Wonsley asked why we are so quick to call this an accident. The grand jury will tell her. The investigation continues. The lungs are in the state's possession. The phone is being examined. The answer is coming. One final thought about what the specific sequence of withheld evidence means for how the public understands this investigation. The official autopsy findings have not been released. The lung examination results have not been shared with the independent pathologist. The toxicology is pending. The phone forensics are ongoing. The grand jury has not convened. Each of those withholdings is explainable. The autopsy report is being finalized. The lung findings are retained for potential additional testing. The toxicology takes time. The phone forensics require careful documentation. The grand jury waits for a complete investigation. But the cumulative effect of all of those withholdings, in a case where the family's independent pathologist cannot rule out neck injury, where the phone was on the boat instead of with the body, where the emergency audio has 12 seconds that stop people mid-replay, where a young black man did not come home from a boat trip in Mississippi, The cumulative effect is the specific experience of a family and a community that are watching official institutions withhold the specific information that would allow an independent assessment of what happened. That experience is what Ben Crump is pointing to when he says, "Our lived experiences tell us to question everything." That experience is what Christine Wansley is pointing to when she asks why we are so quick. That experience is what Ms. Rachel, with her 13 million subscribers, communicated to millions of parents who do not follow true crime news. The answer is in the official record. The official record has not been publicly shared. September or October. The grand jury will hear it. And when it does, the answer to what happened to Nolan Wells, the young man who made salmon for his family and got on a boat with his friends, and whose lungs are now in the possession of the Mississippi State Medical Examiner, and whose phone was on the boat that came home without him, will be part of the official legal record of Jackson County, Mississippi. His parents deserve that answer. The investigation will produce it. He made salmon for his family. He went to the island. The boat came home. The answer is coming. If you have any information about what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island on July 4th, 2026, contact the Jackson County Sheriff's Office or the FBI's Jackson Field Office. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. Do you think the grand jury will produce charges? And what detail in this case has changed your mind the most? We read every single comment. We will be back tomorrow.